Welcome to the Northeastern IPM Tick IPM series. We are about to start our presentation, and I am Jana Hexter. I work for the Northeastern IPM Center based in Ithaca, New York, and we're excited to have the last of our series on tick-borne disease, expansion and management strategies, the role of leaf litter and snow on tick survival, which I think is hopefully very timely for all of us. I'm certainly seeing the leaves ready to turn and drop in my garden, so I'm excited to hear what Kirby has to share with us today. So next slide, please. So there is a recording of this webinar and it will be available in about a week. If you are registered for this webinar, you will receive a copy of the recording once it's edited and uploaded. And in addition, we'll put it up on our website. If you missed any of the earlier in the series, this is number 7 of a series. If you missed the first 6, you can go to this link, easily findable on our website, to see recordings of past webinars, and feel free to do that. Next slide, please. We welcome your questions and we ask you to do it in a really specific way. So it's hard for us to monitor chat when we have a lot of people on the call. And we often find that people have similar questions. So instead of using the chat, if you scroll your mouse over your screen, you'll see a black box appear. And somewhere in that black box, usually it's in the middle. Right now, this morning, it's on one side for me. There are 2 squares and it says Q&A. And if you click on there, you can ask a question and you can mark it anonymously if you'd like to. And it gives us a chance to see the questions. And then if 2 people or 3 people have a similar question, I can ask the same question at that time and mark them answered. So I'll ask that you use that feature. Next slide, please. I'm delighted to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Kirby Stafford. His research area is in the ecology, distribution, and control of black-legged ticks, and more recently, the Lone Star tick, with a focus on natural, biological, and integrated tick control. Dr. Stafford has authored 92 articles and presented research at national and international meetings, and serves on multiple regional and national tick-related committees, and has given over 1,300 media interviews and public talks. So we are delighted to have him with us today. Next slide, please. So before we begin, we're going to have some questions for you. It gives us a sense of who is on the call and your level of interest and expertise. And in one moment, you should see a poll pop up on your screen. And as soon as you've answered all the questions, you'll be able to hit end poll. There are no right and wrong answers. This is not a test, it's simply a question. And I'll be quiet while that happens. Okay, so I will end the poll and share the results with you. So the vast majority of people are moderately or very knowledgeable about the role of habitat changes on tick populations. That's great to hear. And also most people fall into the moderately or very knowledgeable categories of knowing about preventative landscaping methods. So we've got a pretty sophisticated crowd with us today. The most people are not currently using practices to reduce tick habitats, and of those that are, they're using leaf litter. So with that, we will move on to the presentation. And again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to your questions when we have several breaks scheduled in this webinar to answer your questions. So please feel free to pop them up when you can. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Stafford.
Thank you, Donna. So today, I thought I would start off with this quote by Eisen et al. In 2012 on their article, "What do we need to know about disease ecology to prevent Lyme disease in the northeastern United States?" And it's basically habitat diversity, environmental factors influencing survival and tick activity, and the geographic distribution of the ticks impacts the risk of tick-borne disease. So what I want to do today is just kind of briefly give an overview of the drivers for the emergence and expansion of ticks and tick-borne diseases highlight a little bit of the research on climate factors and their influence on ticks, and then kind of drill down to present our overwintering research on the role of leaf litter and snow and vegetation on tick overwintering survival and management strategies for Ixodes scapularis and Amblyomma americanum, and and then conclude by getting into some more general aspects of vegetative management and tick IPM. So let's start off with tick emergence and expansion. There's a number of broad drivers of tick-borne disease emergence, particularly for the black-legged tick Ixodes scapularis. And these include reforestation, overabundance of deer. For example, just here in Connecticut, back in 1896, it was estimated there was only 12 deer in the state, whereas we have tens of thousands of deer present today. We've seen an expansion of suburbia into wooded areas. Abundant habitat around homes for the reservoir hosts. We've seen an increased numbers of ticks, which of course leads to an increased exposure opportunities for people. And then focusing on this particular webinar, we have the geographic expansion of ticks and the role of changing climate. So, and I think probably from the poll, I think most of you are aware that the majority of reported vector-borne diseases are spread by ticks, with Lyme disease being the leading arthropod-borne disease here in the United States. But interestingly, other tick-borne diseases comprises 27 to 28% of the reported disease cases in 2017 and 2018. So even though Lyme disease is the major one, we're dealing with an increasing number of other tick-borne diseases as well. So here in the eastern United States, we have 5 ticks of major concern. These are the black-legged tick, Ixodes scapularis, which is the main focus today, the American dog tick, Dermacentor variabilis, the Lone Star tick, Amblyomma americanum, increasingly the Gulf Coast tick, Amblyomma maculatum, and our new Asian longhorn tick, Haemaphysalis longicornis. And basically the patterns are we're seeing native ticks expand their range, such as the Lone Star tick and the Gulf Coast tick, well, and the black-legged tick too, actually. We are discovering ever more new disease pathogens and more people potentially exposed to these pathogens. We continue to detect exotic tick species in humans coming in from their foreign travel activities, as well as the animal trade, which, of course, in some yet unknown course, led to the introduction and establishment of the invasive Asian longhorn tick. So when we talk about expansion, we usually kind of think of some of the other ticks expanding their range, but you got to bear in mind too that since the discovery of Lyme disease in Connecticut in the mid-1970s, we've seen an expansion of Lyme disease cases, as well as the geographic distribution of the black-legged tick, as you can see illustrated in 1996, with the expansion all through the Northeast and within the upper Midwest in 2018. And then the lower illustration, you can see the known distribution of the black-legged tick Ixodes scapularis by county. And its range has increased quite substantially as well. Along with that, we've also seen the expansion of Lone Star ticks, Amblyomma americanum, into the northeastern United States, as well as into the Midwest. So basically here on the right, what you'll see is that we actually discovered, we were seeing an increase in Lone Star tick submissions to our tick testing laboratory here at the Agricultural Experiment Station. And then in 2017, I discovered an extremely heavy population on an island down in the southwestern area of the state, which you can see in the map here. Of Connecticut, where we were seeing increased reports of Lone Star ticks. This was a highly populated island with Lone Star ticks here. You can see a young buck that was just loaded with these ticks. But interestingly, data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration shows that every Northeast state except Pennsylvania, the temperatures of the winter months of December through February has risen by 2 degrees Celsius since 1895, 1896. And in this graph here on the left, you can see that was put together by the Washington Post illustrating this. Here you can see degree of temperature change, and you'll see how the temperature changes has risen quite dramatically here in New Jersey, Long Island, along the New England coast. And these are areas where we're seeing Lone Star ticks emerge. They moved into Long Island in the early 1990s and are now present along coastal Connecticut, Rhode Island, and even Cape Cod and the islands off the Cape. And so it correlates very nicely with the increase that we've seen in these winter temperatures. So to quote from this paper, Climate Change, Biodiversity, Ticks and Tick-Borne Diseases, the Butterfly Effect, tick questing activity, reproduction, and survival depend on several factors that in turn have a direct impact on tick distribution and abundance. These include vegetation coverage, host availability, moisture and temperature conditions, photoperiod, and human activities. It may be anticipated that warmer winters and extended autumn and spring seasons will continue to drive the expansion of the distribution of tick species, and he was referring to Ixodes ricinus in this case in Europe, to northern latitudes and higher altitudes, and we're definitely seeing that here. So at this point, I believe we're gonna address any questions.
Yes, and let's see what we have here. Actually, we don't have any open questions at the moment, so which often happens at the beginning of a webinar. So please feel free to add your questions as Kirby moves ahead.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's drill in just a little bit more closely on climate and ticks. So if we drill into this a little more closely and look at the drivers for change in geographic distribution and establishment of ticks, you'll see there are climatic factors such as temperature, rainfall, and snow cover. Ecological factors such as the vegetation and habitat type and structure. And of course, hosts. The presence of hosts, the abundance of hosts is very important as well. And as you can see from these arrows, you'll see these drivers will influence winter survival, survival in general, tick development, reproduction, and dispersal. And all of these play a role in the establishment of ticks, not only geographically within the United States here, but also possibly just the establishment and how well they do in your own backyard. So we're going to drill down even further and look at the impact on expansion and establishment and control of particularly the black-legged tick, also the Lone Star tick, although I will mention briefly the Asian longhorn tick as well in this particular presentation. So let's go back a little bit. This was a study that I did back in the early 1990s, looking at the survival of Ixodes scapularis at different relative humidities in the laboratory. And as you can see here, for larval black-legged ticks, you can see that survival drops off really rapidly at humidities below 93%. Here in the line, you can see this is 100%, this is 93%, this is 85%, and below that, it just drops off quite dramatically. Here for the nymphal stage, they're a little more robust, but again, you'll see that survival is pretty good at 193%. Lasts for a while and drops off at 85%, but at lower humidities, survival is curtailed pretty rapidly. Many Ixodes ticks require higher humidities, obviously, for survival than other tick species and quickly die from desiccation when held below what we call their critical equilibrium activity. This is the threshold humidity at which ticks can maintain their water level by the active uptake of atmospheric water vapor. So humidity is very important to their survival. In a study by Van Dyck et al. In 1996, they looked at the survival of Ixodes scapularis that was exposed to cold. So what you see here on this graph, you can see the flat nymphs with corresponding very low temperatures. And what they found is that unengorged nymphs were the most cold hardy life stage. And they mentioned that future studies using soil microclimatic measurements in geographic information systems may be able to help pivot or provide models for potential geographic distribution of Ixodes scapularis. And we're starting, and other models have shown this in Canada in this study that was published by Patrick Layton and et al. In 2012. Temperature was the most important determinant of environmental suitability for tick establishment in their model. Climate warming, they calculated, would accelerate the range expansion of Ixodes scapularis, currently modeled at 28 miles per year, with human population risk increasing from 18% in 2010 to over 80% by 2020. Interestingly, mild and shorter winters is also favoring the northern expansion of the white-footed mouse, the reservoir host for Lyme and other disease and other pathogens associated with the black-legged tick in Quebec as well. So we're seeing multiple factors here influencing the expansion. They've also modeled the potential distribution of Lone Star tick in the United States. This is a paper by Reghaven et al. In 2019, where they mapped the climatologically suitable regions for the Lone Star tick in North America, and you can see that it extends through the southeast and is here up along coastal New England. Acrological surveys in areas outside the currently believed leading edge of the distribution of Lone Star ticks, coupled with recent reports of their identification in previously uninvaded areas in the public health literature, suggests that the species is more broadly distributed in North America than currently understood. Further northward and westward expansion of these ticks can be expected as a result of ongoing climate change. The Asian longhorn tick, Haemaphysalis longicornis, of course, was discovered in New Jersey back in 2017, has now been reported from 15 states. Shown the latest map here of reports by county as of October 2nd, 2020. Obviously, it's working its way up here into the northern states. And one of the things we'll obviously be interested in is looking at overwintering of the Asian longhorn tick. What kind of habit environment is it found? What stage does it primarily overwinter? It turns out that's the nymphal stage. And in research to date, you can see that this tick has been found in a diversity of habitats, but it has been most abundant on trail edges with short to medium height grass. So this leaf litter or other vegetative characteristics impact the survival of this tick as well. Something that remains to be seen. So in this study from South Korea, which is part of this tick's native range, the researchers found that Haemaphysalis longicornis preferred herbaceous areas, including grassland and shrub vegetation, as their overwintering habitats. Among the overwintering longicornis collected, 77% of the ticks were retrieved from the topsoil layer, whereas 19% and 4% of overwintering individuals were found in the leaf litter and soil surface, respectively. The results of the study indicate the tick might crawl into the soil and prefer to settle in the topsoil layer as an overwintering habitat. So it'll be interesting as we work forward how this pertains to the tick here in the northeastern United States. And certainly early models on the potential distribution of Haemaphysalis longicornis in the United States certainly indicates that we can continue to at least to see it continue to expand here along in the Northeast and parts of the Midwest, particularly along the Atlantic and seaboard here in the Midwest, in the Mid-Atlantic states and New England. So questions at this point?
Yes, we have two very interesting questions. So one is asked by Elton Ragosi, who I believe is not in the United States. So bear that in mind. He said, how is the situation between the tick population and the rodent reservoirs as their hosts? Are the rodents the main host for I. scapularis in your country?
Okay, so here in the Northeast and the upper Midwestern United States, the white-footed mouse is the primary host for the immature stages of the tick and the reservoir for the agents that cause Lyme disease, babesiosis, and anaplasmosis. So, but other animals play a role as well. Chipmunks are a secondary reservoir host, as are shrews.
Right. Lovely, thank you. And Stephen Breimer said, what mechanisms do ticks employ to absorb water and water vapor from the environment?
So actually the way ticks do that, because larval ticks actually absorb oxygen and that directly, for example, through the cuticle, they don't have spiracles, but ticks actually through their mouth parts will use, and a way of using salts to absorb moisture right out of the air and then take it into the body.
Thank you. All right, those are the questions we have for this break. Oh, we have one more actually. Jill Auerbach says, have H. longicornis been found to harbor any pathogens in the US in cattle and humans, etc.?
So far, they have not. A lot of the ticks have been tested. None have been found to harbor any pathogens. In the laboratory, they have found incompetent for transmitting Borrelia burgdorferi, the spirochete that causes Lyme disease. However, they have been found capable of transmitting Rickettsia rickettsii, the pathogen that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Again, those were laboratory studies.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, let's move ahead.
Okay. So now we're going to drill down a little more closely and look at some of the results of our overwintering research. So this was actually initiated from a study that we did a number of years back where we used a 25-year data set of Ixodes scapularis drag sampling surveys at 2 locations in Connecticut to investigate the relationship between average nymphal density and regional weather variables. And what we found was an association between greater summer nymphal Ixodes scapularis populations and higher winter, that is particularly in January, precipitation using the standardized precipitation index. So in other words, nymphal tick density increased in those summers that were preceded with good regional winter precipitation and total snow cover. Now, previous studies have indicated that snow reduces energy loss, keeps soil temperatures much higher than air temperatures in winter, and may also reduce detrimental freeze-thaw cycles. So the results of this story suggested that cold, dry winters would adverse overwintering survival for the tick. And our hypothesis was that greater snowfall would increase tick overwintering survival rates, and the greater amount of snowfall during the January supports higher rates of tick overwinter survival, and thus larger nymphal cohort sizes the following summer. You know, sometimes I often get asked by the press that says, well, it's been a really bad winter. How are the ticks doing? And of course, underneath all that snow, they're doing just fine. So basically, weather conditions during the coldest months of the year may serve as a bottleneck to tick populations, functioning as an important correlate of not only tick densities, the nymphal densities the following summer, but also the entomological risk associated with tick-borne pathogens transmitted by black-legged ticks as well. So in 2015, we initiated a study of Ixodes scapularis and Amblyomma americanum overwintering in Connecticut and Maine, which was funded initially by the Northeast IPM Center. And we did this study in cooperation with the Maine Medical Center Research Institute. And the studies were actually carried out at our research farm here in Connecticut, in Hamden, Connecticut, and at Cape Elizabeth, Maine. Both of these are the coastal climate areas of both states, the category 3 areas here in both states. And I think this is really important, and it really comes home if you look at both Connecticut and Maine's minimum temperature time series for winter. And as you can see here over time, we've seen a steady increase in the minimum temperatures. So I think this is, again, going back to what I pointed out earlier, one of the main driving forces in, for example, the Lone Star tick moving up into northern latitudes here. So in this study, both species of ticks were placed in vials and tick pots buried in the ground with hobo data loggers and a complete randomized block design with 2 factors, snow and leaf litter. Okay, the study with Ixodes scapularis began in the winter of 2015, was carried for 3 years. And the study with adults of Amblyomma americanum began in the winter of 2016, again was conducted for 3 years. We had 4 treatment combinations. We had leaf and snow removal, no leaf removal and snow removal, leaf removal and no snow removal, just reversing those. And then, of course, the control was no leaf and no snow removal. And here you can see a plot where we just removed the snow shortly after a snowfall. And one of the interesting things we ran into is when we started to study, we had several winters with lots of snow, and then we started to study, and we ended up with winters with notably less snow. But nonetheless, here in this graph, just to give you a feel for the differences in temperature, this is just an example of year 1 minimum temperatures for all 4 treatment types and the ambient temperature for 5-day intervals starting in mid-December through the end of February. So here is the ambient temperature, quite low. And then here, of course, is where we have actually removed the leaf litter and snow. And here is the control where we haven't. You can see removed either of those. So you can see quite a range of difference here in the temperatures. This graph here shows mean hourly temperature by treatment for Connecticut and Maine for years 1, 2, and 3 that are combined. And again, the point I'm making on this slide again is here in Connecticut, you can see that the mean hourly temperatures were much higher than they were along coastal Maine, and a corresponding survival of the Lone Star ticks, which we'll get into here in a moment, but not a huge difference here in Connecticut, but a quite dramatic difference between leaf and snow removal, even versus ambient and the control here in Maine. So just to give you a ready example, this just shows the results of the overwinter survival of the black-legged tick in Connecticut in the first year. No real difference between leaf removal or snow removal, but here you can see the control where survival was 94%, quite high, but it was significantly higher than the 77% survival where both leaf and snow was removal. So we saw greater mortality when you had no vegetative or snow cover to provide any insulation. So to summarize, this has been published in the journal Insects. So basically here for all 3 years, you can see that survival of black-legged ticks was 77, 94, 38 to 63, 54 to 67 was relatively high under all of the treatments. But again, there was some significant differences due to leaf removal and snow removal. Maine survival was a lot less, and there was actually, here you can see it was actually most dramatic in 2018, but you can see a significant drop here as leaf removal and snow removal conditions in the survival of the black-legged tick up in Maine. So our conclusions were that there were significant difference in black-legged nymph overwintering survival between treatments. For all 3 winters, regardless of location, the fact when you were not removing any of the insulating leaf litter or snow had significantly greater survival compared to the other conditions. So this results indicate that leaf litter removal negatively impacted nymphal survival, and it provides a consistent insulated barrier from winter conditions. We didn't really see any statistical difference in multiple comparisons with snow removal, and it was probably due to the inconsistent insulating effect of snow accumulation on overwintering ticks. As I mentioned, we ended up with winters with a lot less snow than we had seen just the previous years. So this field study determined that leaf litter plays a more significant role in overwintering nymph survival than previously reported. This chart shows the overwintering survival for adult Lone Star ticks. And I'm not going to go through all these in real depth, but what I want to point out, you can see here in Connecticut, it tends to be moderate to fairly high in all 3 winters, ranging from 31 to 69, 81%. And here, you know, we're talking up to 69, 73%. A little higher, of course, where we have no snow and no leaves removed. Again, it's relatively consistent. But in Maine, you can see that survival was much lower under all conditions, whether the leaf or snow was removed or not removed. This year was particularly harsh. Maine here this year, survival was much better, indicating that the Lone Star tick can make it through the winters on some winters here, where there was plenty of leaf litter and snow. 79% of the females and 42% of the males made it through the winter. And then, of course, the last year we were only able to look at males, but again, you can see that there's quite a difference between the low survival in Maine, where there was any combination of snow and leaf removal versus no leaf and snow removal. So again, leaf and snow presence was a really major factor on survival of Lone Star ticks, particularly up in Maine. Now, there have been a lot of submissions of Amblyomma americanum in Maine from residents that have no out-of-state travel history, but at this point in time, there's yet no established populations that have been detected in Maine. These are ticks that are probably coming in off of migrating birds, but it just points out that eventually some of those may actually have the capability of surviving along coastal Maine. And to illustrate that, this is another graph from that paper from Raghaven 2019 showing predicted future suitable regions under climate change scenarios, where here in red you can see a gain in the distribution here, which makes sense, even further north over time. But ironically, as it gets hotter and warmer, we could actually see a loss in the range of the Lone Star tick along its very southern current range. So, but nonetheless, I think the story is that we're probably going to continue to see this tick moving north as the climate warms up and we have insulating factors that can help that. Questions?
Yeah, we have some great questions. And actually, I'm going to start with one that just came in, and it's similar to a question that I had. So Abdel Ghaffar Al-Kishi asked, what is the size of the area without snow or leaf? And I actually had that same question: is how do you remove the snow, and are you continuously removing the snow for that area?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think snow removal is as far as a management is going to be, really practical. Leaf litters, we'll get into that in a little more detail here in a moment. I think the important question is how much snow plays as survival in general. And so just people can think about the fact that, if you got a really snowy winter and you've got a lot of snow, those ticks are doing very well underneath that blanket of snow. On the other hand, you could probably anticipate fewer ticks, relatively speaking, if it turns out to be a relatively dry and cold winter.
Great. And what was the square footage of the area that you did the removal on?
Oh yeah, so basically we removed it where the tick pots were located. So you're talking about a small area right there.
Okay, all right, great. Okay, so Scott Larson asked, are there any similar results in the 25-year study on greater larval Scapularis population sizes after higher winter precipitation or total snow cover as seen in the nymphal ticks?
If you're talking about similar results, I haven't seen any comparable analysis done with larval ticks. Got to remember, larval ticks is not the main overwintering stage. Most of the larvae are going to molt to nymphs before the winter and overwinter as nymphs. I think there is some larval overwintering, but not a lot.
Great. And Stephen Braemar said, can the abundance of tick populations after winters with much snow be attributed to the exclusion of natural enemies that can't tolerate or survive the cold, snowy winters?
Ironically, unfortunately, ticks don't have many natural enemies. There is some predation, but that tends to be a little more opportunistic by those predators that do consume ticks. And we really don't have much in a way. There's one parasitoid that attacks this tick, Hunterellus hookeri. But that parasitoid's inefficient and actually disappears at lower tick densities. It's only found in areas with extremely high tick densities. That's some research that I did back in the early 1990s.
Great. Mark Lasher asked, any differences in tick populations in areas that receive a lot of wet snow as opposed to dry snow?
That has not been looked at. That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. David Beckman says, what drives the difference in survival between male and female ticks?
Another good question. I don't have an answer for that one. Yes.
All right. And Marco Notarangelo says, any idea whether infection by Borrelia anaplasma or Babesia influences overwintering by nymph ticks?
Another good questions we don't have an answer to yet. These are all good areas for potential further research.
Yeah, they are good questions. Great. All right, wonderful. So we will move on ahead and keep sending us your great questions. I think we've employed Kirby for the next 5 years with good questions.
Yeah, a lot of good research questions. So what I want to do now is just kind of focus in a little more on these landscape characteristics. So basically, remember, the presence of ticks depends on the presence and abundance of appropriate hosts, obviously, and the environment. Simple arrival in a new environment is not necessarily sufficient for establishment. Ticks are vulnerable to environmental conditions, as we have been discussing. Most ticks require high humidity and cover for their survival. They're found mainly in the leaf litter, ground cover, or vegetation, in the woodland or ecotone. And most hard ticks, now we're talking hard ticks, these exotic ticks are what we call hard ticks because of the sputum found on these ticks, spend 95% of the time at or just below ground cover in the leaf litter or duff, either digesting a blood meal they've just gotten, molting to the next stage, in diapause, or host seeking. So these ground conditions are critical to survival, as we've been discussing. So as we look at this, we think about where are the risks in your habitat. And so we look at an area where your tick risk zone is and your less risky zones. So parts of schools and park grounds are probably already landscaped in what we call a tick safe zone, because they're lawns, they're mowed fields, open playgrounds, and of course, obviously buildings. So the landscaping in this kind of environment is going to be at the edge is going to be the most important parameter, because studies have found that say about 67% of the black-legged tick populations back there in the woods, 22% are in the ecotone, and 2% are out ranging out into the more lawn or exposed areas. But even on the lawn, I found years ago that 82% of the ticks I picked up at houses were within the 3 meters of that edge of the ecotone or stone walls, with 18% found further out into the lawn environment. So there's a definite distribution that we're dealing with here. And so this does influence your residential landscape for management of Ixodes scapularis. I found that this is a property that was in Oline, Connecticut, lots of ticks, kind of woody. Look at the swing set over here. This is what it looked like after they cleaned it up, put a little wood chip barrier, opened things up to more sunlight, and it quite dramatically reduced the number of ticks on the lawn. And so we found that removing leaf litter along the lawn edge here reduced the number of ticks, at least at the lawn edge, by 49 to 70%. We found that landscape barriers using wood chips, although it doesn't have to be wood chips, any kind of barrier would reduce the number of ticks moving into the lawn by 35 to 77%. And of course, again, think ground cover. I've picked up ticks in Pachysandra right next to garden hoses, next to the front doorsteps. I mean, Pachysandra can be a great cover under certain conditions like steep slopes and things like that, but probably isn't the best thing to do right next to where you're frequently walking. Because remember, most of the ticks are picked up from that lower vegetation. This is a host-seeking nymphal Ixodes scapularis. They're at the edge of the grass waiting for a host to come by. So most ticks are picked up on the lower extremities and then rapidly can be crawl up the body and be found attached almost anywhere. So in your property, you think about your tick zone, which is your, again, going back to the graph on the previous slide, where the majority of the ticks are, and along that edge. And so landscaping can reduce the number of ticks into what I call the tick safer zone on the property. So in terms of leaf litter management, so basically we found that leaf litter increases overwintering survival of Ixodes scapularis nymphs and Amblyomma americanum adults. And another study that recently was published by Jordan and Schultze in 2020, they found that leaf blown or raked accumulation of leaves at the lawn edge was associated with increased number of Nymphaea scapularis. So here you can see the managed edge, the natural edge, and the natural forest, and they've just had a higher number of ticks in that managed edge where they had accumulated those leaves. Now they suggested that removal off-site by bagging would be a possibility, or possibly mulching. I suggest or composting can reduce leaf litter, may help reduce your risk. But how do you balance that with the ecology and other horticultural goals? So bear in mind that leaf litter is also critical habitat for various insects and other arthropods like bumblebees and ground nesting bees. It offers pupation sites for caterpillars of many moss species, things like that. So again, if you've got a thin layer of leaves, you can mulch it and put it, return that organic matter into the lawn. But if you rake and move them to the lawn, garden's perimeter, just bear in mind that there could still be ticks in there. So perhaps, pile them up in an area of the property where the family doesn't really spend that much time to reduce your risk. However, in the case of invasive plants, controlling them can have a dramatic impact on the management of ticks. Higher tick counts are associated with exotic invasive forest understory than with native forest understory or open forest understory. And the abundance of adult black-legged ticks has been infected with Borrelia burgdorferi is greatest in areas with dense stands of Japanese barberry. Similarly, a greater number of Lone Star ticks infected with Ehrlichia species was present in stands of invasive honeysuckle. And the reason is these dense stands provide really great ideal microclimate for ticks, as well as great host habitat. And so the studies here in Connecticut and elsewhere for Lone Star ticks have found that the reduction in long-term management of Japanese barberry can significantly reduce the abundance of infected ticks, and removal of honeysuckle decreased deer activity and the numbers of Ehrlichia infected Lone Star ticks as well. So management of invasive exotic plants can really be an important tool in reducing tick populations as well. So when we look at landscape and vegetation management in the larger tick-borne disease toolbox, we have things like personal protection measures. We don't yet have a Lyme disease vaccine. We have obviously synthetic and various natural and biological controls, alternatives for killing, questing, or host-seeking ticks. We have a variety of rodent-targeted approaches, such as Macaricide bait box and tick tubes. We have deer-targeted approaches, such as deer fencing, deer reduction, and topical feeder stations for treating deer to kill ticks that are on them. So, but vegetative and landscape management is yet another tool within this toolbox. So that hardscaping and xeriscaping can be helpful in parts of your property, maintaining the grass short, removing some of the weeds and along the edge, removing leaf litter and brush and as well as rodent harborage, particularly around stone walls that are so characteristic of New England, can be an important tool in this overall IPM strategy for managing ticks as well. So where do we go from here? Widespread and expanding and difficult to control ticks and tick-borne diseases continue to be a major problem here in the U.S. and worldwide. What do we need to know about disease ecology to prevent Lyme disease in northeastern United States or even other tick-borne diseases? There were some excellent questions that were already raised that pertain to the ecology of ticks for which we still don't have answers. Can these vegetative approaches work for some other tick species? There's some good areas for research there as well. So that just kind of highlights that further studies are needed to investigate those complex relationships between the landscape, climate, host communities, biodiversity, tick demography, pathogen diversity, human demography, human behavior, economics, all of these things, and human exposure to pathogens, all within that ecological complex of ticks that are present, not only on a regional, national scale, but right in your own backyard as well. Of course, this research couldn't have been done without the assistance of my colleagues. So here, the overwintering studies were conducted with my colleagues, Dr. Megan Linsky, a postdoctoral scientist here at the Experiment Station, and Dr. Scott Williams, along with technicians Heidi Stuber and Michael Short. Really appreciate their work. The studies in Maine were conducted by Charles Lebezic and Maggie Welch up there. And of course, Dr. Pete Thiel kindly provided the Lone Star ticks for our overwintering studies that we initiated before we actually discovered heavy populations right here in Connecticut itself. So I thought I would wrap up with a couple of interesting quotes. Pliny the Elder actually noted that ticks were the foulest and nastiest creatures that be. I don't think too many people would disagree with that sentiment. And ironically, Pierre Calme in 1754, in his Travels of North America, he actually noted in a number of places in his journal how unpleasant a location could be due to the number of ticks that he was encountering. So he noted that this small, vile creature, the tick, may in the future cause inhabitants of this land, the U.S., great damage unless a method is discovered which will prevent it from increasing at such a shocking rate. Who could believe that he would actually be such a prophet, right? That quote certainly applies today. So I appreciate you all joining this webinar, and thank you. And my contact information here is at the bottom of the slide.
Great, and we have lots of wonderful questions. Joellen Lampman has said, has anyone looked at lawn mowing heights and tick presence? When you say short grass, how short is short?
Yeah, I mean, just good general, lawn care management, I think is important. You don't want to cut it too short. You got to bear in mind that you've also got to follow proper practices to maintain a healthy lawn if you are maintaining a lawn. So you don't want to, under summer, obviously you're not going to cut it too short. So your standard, 2 inches is probably, fine, or whatever is recommended at the time for maintaining a healthy lawn.
Great. Elton Ragosi said, what are the main methods for tick collection that you use? Do you use dragging and flagging? And how do you deal with tick collection at snow time?
Well, you can't collect the ticks when there's a lot of snow. They're hidden underneath it. That's just into that. So, and they're generally not active anyway. So bear in mind, flagging or dragging is our main method for collecting ticks, although we also monitor populations by live trapping white-footed mice, for example. It's a catch and release thing. And so drags is the standard method for collecting ticks across the vegetation. Bear in mind that black-legged ticks, the adult stage is active in the fall and does not hibernate, and will be active in warmer days in the winter if they're not buried under the snow. So you can go out in January, February, and still pick up an adult black-legged tick. Now the other ticks, like Lone Star tick, at least here, in the northern areas, will not, their life cycle basically runs spring through the summer, or late spring through the summer, and you're not going to encounter them during the winter months.
Great. Marco Notarangelo said, have there been studies comparing the quality of barriers, for example, wood chips versus gravel versus pavement, or looking at whether perhaps the width of the barrier is the most important factor?
Now, ironically, there hasn't been a lot of studies. I mean, in the studies that I did, we used wood chips because that's what we could afford to actually put down. We put down black plastic and overlaid them with the wood chips. The wood chips were only effective as long as they were maintained. As they degraded, they became not too much different than the leaf litter. There were some number of published laboratory studies where they found that you know, the more drier type of material inhibited tick movement the most. Cedar chips were actually repellent, but of course, as the active ingredients in the cedar volatilizes, they soon lost that aspect of their detriment to the movement of ticks.
Okay, thank you. Raymond Rainbolt has a comment. He said regarding invasive species, it depends on the species. In Fort Drum, New York, buckthorn is an invasive shrub which has almost no ground cover or leaf litter and are practically tick deserts, which goes back to the lack of cover for ticks to survive. So,
Yeah, very good point. So when we're talking invasive species, we're talking about most invasive species, but obviously this buckthorn is an exception.
right. Stephen Brema said, in your environmental management program, is it possible that you're removing microbiota and pathogens that can be potential organisms for tick control?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of natural control, the main pathogens would be some of the fungi. And the background infection rates are only about 1 or 2%. That there's a couple of studies that have looked at that. And in fact, one of them, the Metarhizium anopheles, which is actually now Metarhizium bruneum, was actually formulated into a biopesticide for tick control called MET52, which unfortunately I think that product is now being on the market to be sold and is no longer currently available. But it was we found really good, pretty decent control with it. You know, where it was a suspension of the spores, so it was a biopesticide that you would spray like an insecticide, and we were actually using it on our integrated tick management trials. And so, but again, these pathogenic fungi, natural infection rates tend to be relatively low and certainly not enough to control the population.
Great, thank you. Richard Berman said this has been excellent and thank you very much. So, Jill Auerbach said, is I. scapularis also found in the upper layer of TGE soil?
Good question. We haven't really looked that closely at their distribution within the snow layer, but remember, you know, ticks can move down into the soil a little bit, but you know, they don't dig. They can't dig into the soil as such. So I suspect that they can get down into natural cracks and crevices in the soil.
Okay, we have actually another soil related question. What about soil acidity? Does that affect the presence of ticks?
Good question. I don't think anyone has actually looked at that, but I suspect that within normal ranges of soil acidity, it probably doesn't have a huge factor given the wide distribution of ticks under multiple soil types here through the Northeast.
Yeah. And then Gregory asks, have there been studies of ticks and survival in areas where researchers do occasional or normal burn studies?
Yes, there have been several burn studies. In fact, I conducted one of the earliest ones a couple of decades ago where we did some burns in some state forests here in Connecticut. And it depends on the degree of burn. So what I found is that in a light burn, which was actually done just to kill the smaller trunks to enhance the growth of bigger stems of trees, we did see quite a reduction in the number of ticks, but I also found some of the ticks surviving underneath that leaf litter or duff layer in the forest floor. In comparison, another tract that was burned, the fire got a little hotter than planned and it actually burned the leaf litter layer as well, and there were no ticks found in that area after the burn. But I will say it did not take that long for ticks to reestablish themselves in those areas they're brought in off of hosts
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Let's move on to the last little parts of our presentation. If you could move the slide forward for me, please. Great. So we have another poll for you, and you should see it pop up on your screen. And I'll give you a little longer this time. Someone said they didn't quite have time to hit the end. So just a few questions for you to answer and for us to get a sense of how much you've learned and how much this may change your thinking. All right, so we now have a preponderance of people who are very knowledgeable about tick habitats and preventative landscaping methods. An intention to use both leaf litter and invasive plant control, and very likely to increase the use of IPM, actually very likely and extremely likely, so that warms the cockles of our hearts. And so thank you very much for answering that poll. And so if we could go forward to the next slide, please. So we have a site called Find a Colleague, where if you would like to work with people like Dr. Stafford or find other colleagues in the Northeast to collaborate on research projects or other types of IPM work, you can go here and put a profile up, and it's a way of helping people to find each other to collaborate on IPM throughout the region. So I encourage you to go there. It's for everyone. It's not just for researchers. If you're a farmer or landscaper, extension person, you can pop it in there. Next slide, please. As a reminder, the recording is going to be available in about a week, and you'll get an email from me with that link. And next slide. And I want to acknowledge USDA NIFA gives funding for our center, and we also do small research grants. We have an upcoming deadline on November 12th for our partnership grants. You can find information about that on our website. And we also did a webinar earlier this week about the RFA, and that will be posted on our website soon. So please feel free to look at that if you have an interesting project you're interested in getting funding for. And I think Dr. Stafford actually was recently one of our grantees a few years ago. And I would like to end with some acknowledgement by the people who are on the call today. So Mark Lesher said, thank you for your work. The more we know about tick biology, the more we know about how to control them. Jill Auerbach added her thanks as well. And Lynn Gregory said, thank you, Dr. Stafford, for this presentation today. It was really interesting. So I concur, and thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise and your generosity in sharing it with us all.
You're welcome.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.